He thought she was just another woman he could disrespect. He poured coffee on her in broad daylight, laughing at her discomfort. But within minutes, his world came crashing down as he realized who she really was. The sun shone brightly over the city park, filtering through the leaves and casting shifting patterns of light onto the pavement. Birds chirped in the distance, the rhythmic sound of joggers' footsteps mixed with the occasional laughter of children playing near the fountains. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby food cart, mingling with the earthy aroma of damp grass. On a worn wooden bench near the walking trail, Tanya Marshall sat quietly, sipping her coffee, her gaze sweeping across the morning scene. Dressed in a simple button-up shirt and dark jeans, she looked like any other woman enjoying a moment of peace in the middle of a busy day. Her posture was relaxed, yet there was something about her, something subtle, that commanded attention. A quiet authority in the way she held herself, a sharpness in her eyes that suggested she was more than she appeared to be. A few feet away, an elderly man sat reading his newspaper, occasionally glancing over at her. His eyes flickered down to a small detail, a barely visible police badge half tucked inside her pocket. His brows knitted slightly, but he said nothing. Tanya was the newly appointed chief of police, the first black woman to ever hold the position in this city. But today, she wasn't in uniform, wasn't in her office giving orders, or standing in front of cameras for interviews. She wanted to experience the city as it was, raw, unfiltered. She wanted to observe, to see for herself how her officers treated the people they had sworn to protect. She had no doubt that many of them were good, but she also knew there were those who had grown comfortable in their unchecked power. And it was only a matter of time before one of them made a mistake. A few minutes later, the sound of heavy boots crunching against gravel drew her attention. Officer Brad Simmons, a middle-aged white cop with broad shoulders and a squared jaw. He walked with the self-assurance of a man who had spent years exerting his authority with little consequence. His uniform was pressed, his belt filled with the tools of his trade, handcuffs, a taser, a radio clipped to his shoulder. But the most dangerous thing he carried was his unchecked arrogance. His sharp eyes scanned the park, and when they landed on Tanya, something in his expression shifted. A flicker of contempt, a slight curl of his lips. He had seen people like her before. At least, that's what he thought. A black woman sitting alone, dressed simply, sipping coffee as if she belonged there. In his mind, she didn't. Brad took a slow breath, already deciding how this was going to go. Maybe she was homeless. Maybe she was just loitering. But to him, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had the power to remove her, and he was going to enjoy doing it. From the corner of her eye, Tanya saw him approach. She could feel it before he even spoke. The entitled air, the assumption that she was lesser. She let out a slow breath and took another sip of coffee. The game was about to begin. The sound of boots stopped right in front of her. Tanya didn't look up immediately. She took her time, letting the moment stretch, feeling the weight of his presence lingering like an unspoken challenge. Finally, she lifted her eyes and met his gaze. Officer Brad Simmons stood over her, hands on his belt, his expression set in a smirk that carried a dangerous mix of amusement and disdain. "You lost or something?" he asked, his voice carrying a casual arrogance. "This isn't exactly a place to just sit around." Tanya raised an eyebrow, tilting her head slightly. Didn't realize sitting in a public park required permission. Brad let out a short chuckle, shaking his head as if he found her response amusing. But there was no humor in his eyes. "It doesn't," he said, leaning in slightly, "unless you're causing trouble. and from the looks of it, you don't exactly belong here." There it was. The assumption. He didn't know who she was, didn't recognize the authority she held. All he saw was a black woman, alone, occupying a space he thought she had no right to be in. Tanya kept her expression unreadable. "And what exactly do I look like?" Brad grinned, as if enjoying the game. "Someone who should probably move along before they attract the wrong kind of attention." Tanya exhaled slowly. She had seen men like him before, the kind who wielded their authority like a weapon, who measured their power, not in the laws they upheld, but in the fear they could instill. But fear was not something she was about to give him. She stayed seated, her grip tightening slightly around her coffee cup. "I think I'll stay." Brad's smirk faltered for half a second. He wasn't used to being challenged so casually, especially not by someone he had already decided was beneath him. He took another step forward, his shadow now fully covering her. His voice dropped, turning condescending. "Look, lady, I'm trying to be nice here. You wouldn't want me to make you leave, would you?" There was something in the way he said it, a threat wrapped in a smile. Nearby, a few people had stopped to watch. Not many, but enough. A man jogging by slowed his pace, glancing over. A woman pushing a stroller hesitated for a second before continuing. They saw what was happening, but no one stepped in, because they had seen this before. Tanya remained perfectly still, her expression calm, unshaken. Then, with an eerie sort of patience, she set her coffee cup down beside her and looked up at him. "And how exactly do you plan on making me leave, officer?" Brad's jaw clenched. The way she spoke, too confident, too sure of herself, it irritated him. He didn't just want her gone now. He wanted to humiliate her. Brad's hand moved so fast that for a moment, no one processed what had happened. The steaming cup in his hand tilted forward, and a splash of hot coffee poured onto Tanya's lap. A small gasp came from someone nearby. The elderly man with the newspaper tensed, his fingers tightening around the pages. The jogger stopped completely, his eyes widening. But Tanya? She didn't flinch. She didn't cry out, didn't recoil in pain. She just sat there, watching as the coffee soaked into her jeans, the dark liquid spreading across the fabric. Brad's smirk returned. "Oh," he said mockingly. "Clumsy me." Tanya slowly exhaled through her nose. It burned. She could feel the sting, the uncomfortable heat against her skin. But the pain was nothing compared to the fury simmering beneath the surface. Still, she didn't react the way he wanted. She simply picked up a napkin, dabbing at the stain, her movements slow, deliberate. For the first time, Brad's smirk wavered. He had expected an outburst, a scene, something that would justify him dragging her out of the park. Instead, she was too calm, too controlled. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the young officer standing a few feet away, a rookie, barely a year on the force. He had been watching the entire exchange, his face pale, his eyes flickering between them, as if realizing that something was terribly, terribly wrong. He opened his mouth, as if about to say something, but before he could, Tanya spoke first. Her voice was quiet, steady. "That was a mistake." Brad chuckled, trying to mask his sudden unease. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Tanya finally looked him in the eye, and this time there was something different in her gaze, a sharpness, an intensity that sent a shiver down Brad's spine before he could stop it. She leaned forward slightly, her tone deadly calm. "Because now, Officer Simmons." She reached into her pocket, and in one smooth motion, she pulled out her badge. "You're in a lot of trouble." Silence. For the first time since Brad had approached her, the entire park felt like it had stopped breathing. The badge in Tanya's hand gleamed under the sunlight, small yet carrying a weight that sent a chill through the air. Brad's smirk froze in place, but his eyes flickered, just for a second. Doubt, panic, confusion. Then, like a reflex, he laughed, a dry, forced chuckle as he shook his head. "Nice try," he sneered. "You expect me to believe that?" Tanya didn't move, didn't blink. The rookie officer standing a few feet away went rigid, his breath catching in his throat. He had seen that badge before, not in person, but on memos, on the morning briefing slides. He knew exactly who she was. And suddenly, his stomach dropped. Brad was still stuck in his arrogance, still clinging to the belief that this was some kind of joke, some kind of scam. He took a step closer, towering over her, his voice dropping to something low and sharp. "Listen, lady," he spat. "I don't know where you stole that badge from, but if you think—" Tanya stood up, and suddenly, the power shifted. Even though Brad was taller, even though he loomed over her just moments ago, he now felt small. Because Tanya didn't just stand, she commanded. The moment she straightened her shoulders, her full height aligning with an air of authority that could not be faked, something changed in the air. She took a slow step forward. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Brad stumbled back. It wasn't even a full step, just a small shift, but it was enough. Enough for the people watching to notice. The rookie swallowed hard. He had to do something. "Sir," he started, voice shaky. "Maybe we should—" Brad's head snapped toward him. "Shut up." The rookie clamped his mouth shut, but his face was pale. He knew. And the fact that Brad still didn't know? That was dangerous. Tanya exhaled slowly. She had given him a chance, given him a moment to recognize his mistake, to back down, to realize he was standing on the edge of a cliff of his own making. But he was too blind, too arrogant, too convinced of his own superiority to see the warning signs. He squared his shoulders again, doubling down. "You think flashing a fake badge is gonna scare me?" he scoffed. "I should arrest you right now for impersonating an officer." Tanya tilted her head. "You should." Brad blinked. "What?" "You should arrest me." She took another step closer. No fear, no hesitation. "Go ahead, call it in. Put my name through the system." Brad's jaw tightened. Something inside him, a survival instinct maybe, was starting to scream. Because something was wrong. A few feet away, the rookie was slowly stepping back. He wasn't standing beside Brad anymore. He was distancing himself. The other people in the park, joggers, elderly men, mothers with strollers, they weren't just watching now. They were filming. Phones had been pulled out. Eyes were locked on the confrontation. Brad's confidence was cracking. His fingers twitched near his belt. Not on his gun, not yet, but close. Too close. Tanya saw it, and she let the moment stretch, let the tension pull tighter and tighter, until it was on the verge of snapping. Then, she dropped the bomb. "I'm Chief Tanya Marshall," she said, voice steady, lethal in its calmness. "Your new boss." The words hit like a hammer. Brad's breath caught. For a brief moment, his face went blank. No anger, no arrogance, just pure, raw horror. The rookie stepped back again. His hands were shaking now, sweat beading at his temples. Tanya let the silence sink in, let Brad drown in it. She watched as the color drained from his face, as his mind raced through the past few minutes, replaying every single mistake he had made. Then, the fight came back. Brad shook his head violently, like he could physically reject the truth. "No," he breathed. "Denial." Then louder. "No, that's not possible." Tanya simply raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" Brad's fingers twitched again. He was unraveling. His breath was coming faster, his chest rising and falling in rapid succession. He looked around, searching for support, for someone to confirm that this wasn't happening. But there was no one. The rookie was silent. The crowd was silent. The entire world was watching him fall apart. And that was when the final realization set in. He had just attacked his own police chief. Tanya's expression remained unreadable, but her silence was suffocating. Brad's lips parted, like he wanted to say something, but there was nothing left to say. He had made his move. Now, it was her turn. Brad's world collapsed in real time. His breath came in short, uneven bursts. His fingers, still hovering near his belt, twitched, as if his body was scrambling for a response before his brain could process the sheer magnitude of his mistake. Tanya didn't move. She didn't have to. She had already won. She simply watched, calm and unshaken, as the weight of his actions came crashing down on him. Brad swallowed hard, his throat dry. His face, flushed with arrogance just moments ago, now looked hollow, drained of color. The once mocking smirk was gone, replaced by something he never thought he'd feel. Fear. "You..." His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "You're lying." Tanya tilted her head slightly. "Am I?" The rookie officer flinched. He had been standing motionless, frozen in place, but now his hands were shaking. Because he knew. He knew the moment her name left her lips that it was real. That Brad Simmons had just ruined his own career in the span of 5 minutes. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The people watching. The ones who had stayed silent while Brad tormented her. They were no longer bystanders. They were witnesses, and witnesses were dangerous. Brad's lips parted like he wanted to speak, to spin this in his favor, to salvage what little control he thought he still had. But there was nothing left to salvage. Tanya's next words landed like a hammer. "Your badge. Hand it over." The command was soft, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of finality. Brad blinked rapidly, panic creeping in. "Wait, your badge, Officer Simmons," Tanya repeated, voice smooth as glass. "Now." The rookie stepped back further, subtly distancing himself. He wouldn't go down with Brad. Not today. Brad desperately searched for an escape route. His eyes darted toward the crowd, to the cameras filming, to the rookie whose silence was its own condemnation. No allies. No way out. He was drowning, and Tanya was letting him sink. His fingers trembled as they fumbled for his badge. For the first time in his career, his hands felt weak, his authority meaningless. He pulled it from his chest with a jerky motion, staring at the object that once made him untouchable. Now, it was nothing more than a piece of metal. Tanya extended her hand. "Place it in my palm." Brad hesitated. Giving it up meant it was over. Tanya raised an eyebrow. "Do you need me to call internal affairs myself?" His breath hitched. That was it. The final nail in the coffin. Slowly, reluctantly, he placed the badge in her hand. The moment it left his fingers, it felt like his entire identity had been stripped away. Tanya turned it over once, studying it, as if weighing its worth. Or perhaps the worth of the man who had carried it. She finally looked up, meeting his eyes one last time. "You're dismissed." Brad's chest rose in a deep, shaky inhale. His jaw clenched, his fists tightened at his sides. But he didn't fight it. He couldn't. The moment stretched, heavy with humiliation. And then, with slow, dragging steps, Brad turned and walked away. The rookie exhaled sharply, looking between Tanya and the disgraced officer disappearing into the distance. He swallowed, standing at attention, his face unreadable. Tanya turned to him. "What's your name?" "Officer Daniels, ma'am." His voice was steadier now, but still tinged with unease. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I expect a full report by noon." "Yes, ma'am." Without another word, Tanya pocketed Brad's badge and walked away, leaving behind a park full of stunned onlookers and a cautionary tale that no one would soon forget. Brad walked away like a man in freefall, silent, humiliated, powerless. His once commanding stride was now sluggish, his shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of reality. He had walked into the park thinking he owned it. Now, he was leaving as a nobody. The crowd remained frozen, absorbing what they had just witnessed. The tension that had gripped the air moments ago had transformed into something different, an unspoken shift in power. Phones were still raised, videos were still recording, and Brad knew. This moment, his downfall, was going to spread like wildfire. He clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to look back, to see the faces of the people who had once feared him, but now only pitied him. But he didn't need to turn around to feel their eyes. He could feel their judgment burning into him. Tanya, however, didn't spare him another glance. He was no longer worth her time. Instead, she turned her attention to the young officer, Daniels, who stood stiffly, watching his former colleague disappear. His face was pale, his hands clenched at his sides. Tanya studied him for a moment before speaking, her tone measured. "You saw everything." Daniels swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." "Then you know what happens next." He hesitated but then nodded. "Full report. Internal review." A small pause. Then, his voice dropped slightly. "And consequences." Tanya's expression remained unreadable, but something in her eyes flickered. A test, a silent question. Daniels held her gaze. "There should be consequences." Tanya nodded once, satisfied. Perhaps there was still hope for him. She turned away, adjusting the badge in her pocket. The same badge Brad had once used as a weapon, but had now been stripped of its power. The park was still watching. The weight of what had just happened would not fade easily. And as Tanya walked past the stunned faces, past the cameras still recording, she knew one thing for certain. The city would remember this day. Tanya walked away, her steps steady, her expression unreadable. She had nothing left to prove. The lesson had already been delivered, and Brad Simmons, once so sure of his own power, had learned it the hard way. Behind her, the rookie officer, Daniels, remained frozen, his eyes still fixed on the badge in Tanya's pocket. He had seen corrupt officers before, had heard the whispers about abuse of power, but never had he witnessed a downfall so swift, so absolute. Brad, now just a man without a badge, stood motionless, his fists clenched at his sides. The weight of humiliation pressed down on him like a crushing force. He had spent years using his authority to belittle others, never imagining that one day he'd be the one standing powerless. The park, once filled with quiet observers, erupted into whispers. Phones lowered, glances were exchanged. Some people looked satisfied, others just shook their heads. This was justice unfolding in real time. Tanya exhaled, feeling the cool air against her skin. Another bad cop exposed, another lesson taught. And yet, she knew this wasn't the end. This was just one battle in a much bigger war. As she disappeared down the path, a single thought echoed in the air. Power doesn't corrupt people. People corrupt power. What would you have done in Tanya's place? Do you think Brad got what he deserved? Let's talk in the comments below. If you believe in justice, hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe for more powerful stories that need to be told. Let's keep the conversation going.